Good morning. I'm Dr. Gerry Henwood, and today I have the pleasure of introducing and chatting with another educator, Noel Falco Dolan, who is the Director of Academic Affairs at Villanova University. Good morning, Noel. Very nice to have you here. And my first question to you is, could you tell me exactly what your responsibilities with a title like that means?
Sure. I'm Director of Academic Learning Communities at Villanova, which is a first-year program. We have about 1,600, 1,650 first-year students, and for academic learning communities, we're looking at a living and learning experience combined together so that our students take together the required first-year seminar class, which is a writing-intensive class that focuses on great books, called Augustine and Culture Seminar. They select a particular theme to pursue within that study. So, for example, my own students study art and culture. And then they're housed together in the same residence hall, and they're given the opportunity to explore the area through some coordinated co-curricular events that line up with what they might be reading. So, for example, at the beginning of this year, I sent a busload of students into Philadelphia to do a walking mural mile tour, which we've done in the past, which was focused on restorative justice. And then we just took a group 2 weeks ago down to the University of Pennsylvania Archaeology Museum to look at artifacts from ancient Greece and ancient Rome.
That is wonderful. First of all, I just want to say to you, given what I know about learning theories, that this thematic approach, this interconnected approach, is really what helps students learn. How recent a program is this at Villanova?
So the Learning Communities program is probably around 20 years old right now. It started as something called Villanova Experience, and then it evolved into what we now call Learning Communities more or less about 15 years ago. So Villanova Experience at first was a leadership approach, teaching students leadership skills. And now leadership has become one of our 9 learning communities. It's still our most popular. We fill an entire residence hall with students who say that they want to be leaders in some form or another. We always joke that the RAs say it's a very extroverted dorm, if you can imagine, to have a dorm full of people who are leaders. But as I said, it's one of but 9 themes. And so the other themes cover things like global community, environmental, faith and reason, art and culture, healthy living, different topics like that. Going back though, Augustine and Culture Seminar is what we now call, what used to be called Core Humanities Seminar back in the day, and that dates back to the early 90s. And that was at a point when Villanova was revisiting doing just a generalized Western civilization and turning instead to embrace more, well, what is our mission, what are we about? So looking at Core Humanities was a version of going more interdisciplinary with Western civilization and instead saying, well, let's do a blend of philosophy, literature, political science, theology, and show students how some of the key questions really work across all of these disciplines. And then more specifically embracing Augustine as the core text being Augustine's Confessions, and rebranding the courses Augustine and Culture Seminar. Probably about 10 to 12 years ago now, we went with that title instead.
Very interesting, very interesting. Mm-hmm. Now, something has happened at Villanova that you've become recently involved with, and that is a virtual reality program. And you go into something called The Cave to do this. Could you tell me and the audience what, first of all, is virtual reality?
Okay, so there's virtual reality and there's augmented reality. And most people are probably more familiar with augmented reality if they have smartphones. And at this point, most people have smartphones. If you've played Pokemon Go, or you've put on a Snapchat filter, you've used augmented reality, and that's putting technology and overlaying it on top of what you see in your everyday world. Virtual reality uses that same technology but puts you totally into that other world, the world of technology. So for something like The Cave, you have to put on goggles and you're in a room with screens around you. Our cave has 3 walls, so you're facing the 3 walls, and then you can either activate the floor or we can bring out a retractable ceiling. And so you're immersed in that world, and it feels as if the virtual world is your actual world. Another form of virtual reality people might be familiar with is Oculus Rift. If they've put on those headgears where you're in the space alone so that it generates it right in front of you, as opposed to the cave where the goggles look like putting on a form of sunglasses and then it's surrounding you in a room with other people. So you can have a solo virtual reality experience or you can have a communal virtual reality experience. And the cave is more communal. It works as a classroom.
And for people like myself who aren't necessarily technologically au courant, there is a commercial on TV now where a young man puts on these goggles that you've just described, and his father is sitting over on the side, and he's saying, "What's happened to my son?" I mean,
I know, it's so funny, right? And the kids swiping things and the drones bringing in the pizza.
Is it like that?
Well, you do. The first time I went into the Oculus Rift, because we have an Oculus Rift classroom that we've just gotten up and running too, to learn how to use the gloves, the devices to pick and try things out. It was kind of like that. And I was able to take it home and try it out with the eye to maybe developing some programming for that. And it's funny to watch someone else be in there because the world is so real to them. My son, for example, is 6'2", and we were doing this in our finished basement, and he went into a space where he had to jump, and he kept throwing his hands up and popping out the ceiling tiles because it was very real to him that this was happening, and he kept jumping in fright from whatever it was he was experiencing. So in that sense, it looks a little silly, like the commercial you're talking about. In some of these virtual reality experiences, you do have to activate and interact with what you're seeing. With the cave, there's one person who wears a set of goggles that have little antennae on them that sense the space and locate where that central person is within the space, so that if they move, the experience will move with them, and they get a little handheld device that can either pick things up or move them forward in the space. And so the group works through that leader. With an Oculus Rift, you've got all of that for yourself, and so you're working through that experience on your own, and it's much more within your control. But again, it can look silly to someone outside of it. Yes.
Very, very interesting. Now, in your case, how are you using virtual reality? I know that in reading some of your biographical information, you've been teaching a Langston Hughes unit. Mm-hmm. Could you describe that and tell us what you're doing?
Sure. So with teaching art and culture, I began to move my curriculum in general to find ways to tap into the arts. So either looking for ways of bringing the visual arts in or the performing arts, or to work with music and how music might affect the reading. So I was able to take a unit that I was already teaching with poetry and with Langston Hughes and focus more specifically on his blues poems, thinking that this would have meaning for my students, because a lot of my students are musical. A lot of them are performers. Again, when you talk about the leadership dorm being more extroverted, I know in the residence hall where my students live that there are kind of after-hours a cappella groups forming and being told it's not time to be singing in the stairwells at this point. So I thought they would enjoy the music. So it has evolved from teaching the poems and then realizing they didn't know what the blues were. When Hughes was referring to the blues, when he was talking about the sound of the blues, when the cadences of the blues were in his poems, my students weren't familiar with the blues as a musical art form. So the next step was to tap into bringing the blues into the classroom and playing some. Okay, so now they're listening to it, they have a better sense of it. Then I realized that my colleague Paris Bradley from the theater department actually was in an Americana music band that played the blues. And I asked Paris if he'd be willing to come to class. And he said, sure. And he brought a friend. And it went really well. And they played the blues. The students were able to ask questions. Paris did a show and tell of blues instruments. The next year, I said, do you want to do it again? And he said, sure, why not? That was awesome. And he brought another friend. And so now we had 3 people playing the blues. This past year, we went to the theater. And it was after the last production, so we had the space, and he brought in professional blues players, and he and his friend John were there along with these 2 professional blues players, and it felt more like a little concert. And so what has happened was, hearing the blues meant the next time we went back to the classroom, or the next time we talked about the poems, the students were so much more engaged with hearing the blues and the poems, and the themes of the blues music, and understanding what Hughes was aiming for And what I've learned is, and you probably know this as well as a teacher, if you can engage students with their other senses or their other ways of thinking, then you cross disciplines that way as well. It helps open up a reading or an understanding of the text. So we're not abandoning the text, but finding ways to enter into the text and contextualize it and understand it in new ways. And at this point, so this is a long way around, this has evolved over the years, working with Frank Klassner, Dr. Frank Klassner from the Computer Science Department, who runs the cave and got the original grant for it, I thought, is there a way to take this experience, which I can reproduce each year because I happen to know Paris and John and I have this relationship, is there a way to take that experience and recreate it so that more people can have something like that, where you've got the opportunity to hear the blues and hear the poem and understand how the poem is informed by what blues are and what blues sound like.
That is just such an amazing narrative of what teaching has become like. Many years ago when I started teaching in the 60s, and I would play a song that had to do with my goals in literature, I'd play a Beatles song, and we'd talk about that which interested the students. But what was in the Beatles song had to do with what my goal was in regard to the literature. So now here we are 50 years later, and through technology we have this virtual reality. And given what we know about not all students learn in the same way, that there are different modalities of learning through the senses. I mean, virtual reality sounds like it takes in all of the senses. Now, how do you then bring it back to a more traditional format after the students experience the virtual reality? What do you do thereafter?
It very much has to be a guided experience, and so it's not technology for technology's sake. I'm glad you talked about the different modalities and ways of adapting for the learners. Technology is a tool, like anything else, and that's one of the things in working with Frank that I said up front. Frank was encouraging humanities-based projects. I didn't want to create a project just to use the technology. I wanted a project in which the technology could be more helpful. But again, you can't just say to the students, here, you're in a cave, isn't this fabulous? You know, experience this. Now let's go back and go about our everyday lives. You, as the teacher, still play a role. You have to set up the experience of why you're going into the cave, and when you return from the cave, you have to unpack that experience as well. And that's something that I've learned in the past few years in going into the cave. The first time I went into the cave, and it opened in October of 2014, so I went into the cave probably January, February the following spring when I was teaching my Shakespeare unit. I wanted to go in and have the students be in the Globe Theater so that, again, they could understand, particularly as students who were performers, what it felt like to be on that stage and spatially experience the rest of the globe and understand how that interaction would feel with people right up against you, the way that stage was presenting. And I realized when I went in there that I needed a frame. I needed a setup to have students know what I was looking for, know what I wanted them to think about, and then have a set of questions to kind of guide them so that their attention wasn't just looking all over the place, which is your tendency. You put the goggles on and you want to ooh and ah and look all around. So what did I want them to focus on? So the next time I went in, I was much more directed and guided them, and then I built in time at the end to take the goggles off and talk about what we had just experienced. Since then, I haven't gone back for Shakespeare. I went 2 times. I've switched to going in the fall to go into the Sistine Chapel. And that is part of my Ancients class. And I should explain that Augustine and Culture Seminar is a 2-semester program with Ancients in the fall, typically, and Moderns in the spring, so that students see over time the great books kind of building on one another, these questions continuing in different, not only different disciplines, but different time periods, different movements. So in the fall, when my readings are focused, moving really, I start with the Bhagavad Gita, and then I go into Genesis and move forward. Some of the things that we've looked at in biblical stories of Genesis, and I teach the book of Judith, we then look at how the art reinterprets for the reader and might present a particular view of how the story unfolded, or who was the protagonist, who was the antagonist, according to the artist, particularly with images of women. So then when we get to the Sistine Chapel panels that the students probably have seen independently, in which I asked them to look at somewhat independently, the image of God creating Adam, the image of the fall with the tree in the center. When they go into the Sistine Chapel, they're overwhelmed to realize all of this art is inundating them. It's surrounding them. They can't necessarily pick out one panel and study it in depth the way they were able to when we were in the classroom, or if they were doing it for homework, to present it, because now all of the art is in a different context, and it has a different feeling. And we talk about what that feels like, how the art might have an intent behind it to awe or overwhelm, and what the intention of the space was, and how the art works in the space. And that's something that I can't afford to put all of my students on a plane and fly them over and go into the Sistine Chapel. But within this space, certainly they can have a sense of that feeling of what it would be like to be there. Or to go into St. Peter's Basilica, which I do in the same day as well, and again be awed by the art and realize, it's not art the way they might experience it, which is to kind of browse on Pinterest and pick things you like and put things on, as a screensaver on your phone, or buy a decal that's slapped onto your laptop, or see art collected in a museum. That art was created or crafted with a reason. Someone was trying to impress someone else more often than not, or someone was trying to decorate their home. And again, when you go into the cave, you can have an experience that translates something from being flat on a computer screen to surrounding you in a new way.
Yeah, and in regard to religious art in particular, with so many people being illiterate, the use of art to tell stories, biblical stories as well, through the visual.
Right.
And even back then, they knew about the power of the visual
Yes.
To teach and to communicate.
Yes.
So that's very interesting. Now, how do you assess student learning using virtual reality?
And that's an excellent question. I think that you have to build in, again, where you're going with this. And so for my students, a lot of the times with the co-curricular events that they're doing as being part of the learning community experience, what's built in is a written reflection piece that talks about both what the experience was and then how they connected to it and how it might relate to something else that they've experienced. So what I typically do after we've been into the cave is to make that open for one of their cultural event write-ups to talk about the way in which the technology then changed their experience of the art. Because I haven't yet taught the blues in the cave, I don't know that I would do the same kind of write-up afterward. But already when Paris comes to the classroom afterward, we spend the next class both talking about the poems in relationship to the music, but also just spending time talking about, well, what did that mean? And first I have them do like a little large index card reflection on their own, so that they all have their thoughts written down, and then we go to a larger group reflection as well. And I find that if I don't do that with first writing individually, what happens is one or two people speak and everybody else is like, yeah, that's how I felt too. And you don't want that where everyone kind of hands the experience over to a few lead speakers. So to have them kind of crystallize their thoughts, even if you say just bullet point it, then you can share, and then you find that there actually were some nuances or differences in the experiences that they can now look at their card and feel that they have something more specific to say.
One of the things I hear you mentioning as well is that there has been a collaborative effort on your part and other educators' parts in order to bring this to the forefront. And at the high school level, I know that's what I tried to do. And yet at the high school level, it's very difficult to find the time to collaborate with other professionals and to make these interdisciplinary connections. Now, why isn't that a problem, or is it a problem at the collegiate level?
That also is interesting, because I have found that people have been very willing, and I'm not sure if it's the culture at Villanova that also feeds into that. Our motto is Veritas, Unitas, Caritas. I'm probably getting those out of order now that I've said that out loud, but the Unitas that I put in the center there, that unity, that community, is really important to the Villanova experience. And so as that's our culture to work together, perhaps it's been easier for me to find people willing to give of their time and their talents. And It's been very generous of Paris to give me the time that he's given in the past to come into the classroom. And when I mentioned doing this in a cave version, he said, sure, that sounds awesome. Let me see who I can get. And he was the one who went out and found some blues performers, both acoustic and electric, to come and do the performances for us. Frank, I had worked with before, collaborated on an earlier tech project based on a core text in the ACS program, Augustine's Confessions. And so Frank was giving me time in his mobile development class, mobile app development class with his students. So it was good for his students to have the experience, but Frank was also providing his own expertise, and so we began to build a collaboration from there. Father Alan Fitzgerald from the Augustinian Institute gave his time and talent to that project as well, and was able to pull in people that he knew. So I think that if you get a few people who are excited, then they feed into it, they bring in other people, and you can build from there. Timing-wise, it is different. I taught high school back, that was my starting point right out of grad school, was to teach high school, and I knew my days were very scheduled with classroom experiences, and sometimes I had to be hall monitor or cafeteria monitor, and I also had to have office hours where I could get my work done in the classroom, and I was the advisor for the school paper and the literary magazine, so there was time after school given to that. And it felt as if much of my day was taken up and there wasn't necessarily time to collaborate unless my office time coordinated with someone else's, and then our free time was together. So if we had fifth period both free, we could work on a project. Otherwise, it was harder to do. At the college level, because you're in the classroom for a certain number of hours per week and you have more office hours and greater flexibility with your schedule outside, there's been more time to set that up. So that's been a help from the beginning. But again, you have to say, well, what days are you free? When are you free? Or can we just even do a phone call to kind of work through some of these things. Every now and then you get some development money to say, well, we're going to, actually, apply for a grant for this and find some time, so we'll be funded to spend the time together. And then you might be spending time over the summer to do that work. I know that for some of us, we're building on past relationships, but meeting new people, that's always the challenge. And that's where you kind of are relying on, oh, well, did you ask so-and-so? She's got specialization in this. You should see if you could get her on board. Or, oh, you need to, ask this person as well. And, generally people have been very helpful and excited to give what they can when they can. And sometimes they'll say, I'm really busy with this writing project. Could I write something for you or contribute something in the spring instead? They don't want to be written off, but they might, have to, work around something else they're already committed to.
Right. What are your future plans dealing with the virtual reality? Do you have any thoughts about that?
In terms of development?
Yes.
I have other ideas. They cost more money. This one I said we're able to do because we're all local and we've been able, to fund it on a smaller scale. But some of my earlier proposals to use the cave haven't gone anywhere because they've required more money, and so I'll have to do some grant writing. One of them is to make use of the Augustinian art that is on what we now offer called the Pellegrinagio, which is a pilgrimage to follow in St. Augustine's footsteps in Italy. And we have some of the art from the Pellegrinagio in the app book, in the art gallery, but so much of it is ripe to be 3D filmed and could then be a cave experience. And I'll give you an example. The Gazzoli frescoes in San Gimignano in the Church of St. Augustine, they're behind the altar, and you can stand there, and it's the three-wall experience of the cave itself with these panels stacked one on top of another, telling the story of the life of St. Augustine. Well, it would be ideal if Dr. Klausner could take his camera, put it there behind the altar, do a 3D filming of that, and then that would be your experience to stand in the cave space. And you would feel, and it wouldn't be as damp, I can tell you right now, or cold, as standing in the sanctuary space of the Church of St. Augustine. But there are other places as well, the tomb of St. Augustine in Pavia. That could be another thing that you photographed. And if you could put that so that you could walk around it in the cave space, that would be really cool. And the Augustinians have access to these spaces, so it would be a matter of funding to get someone abroad to do the filming and then to process the film when it came back and everything and get it in the cave. Another was that I had a contact through a friend who lives in London with a person on the Rose Trust, that is the Rose Playhouse Trust, which was the playhouse with which Shakespeare was affiliated before he was with the Globe. and that is currently, they have archaeologically excavated and then infilled to protect the foundation of 3/4 of the Rose Theater.
Is there an opportunity for any member of the public, like myself, given our conversation just now, I would be very interested in going and observing this new pedagogical approach of virtual reality. Is there that opportunity for community members to make an appointment to do that?
I know that the mission of the cave is to be used for teaching purposes, and part of that extends beyond campus, and that we've welcomed high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools, and also Boy Scout troops in the past. So there is a website, www.villanova.edu/cave, that has information on how to do that. I'm sure if there were a group, maybe it was a book group or something like that formed together, could book into the cave. There's a scheduler that you could contact to ask that question. So I'm not sure that it would be open like individually, like one at a time to come through, but if there were a small group coming, that would be a good question to put to the person who directs the cave to say, we'd like to come and this is, why we'd like to be there or what we'd like to see, because there are an array of things to see. So you would state what your intention was, and then they could pull whatever programming to have it to load into the cave experience when you're there. Some of those things would be like to be on the surface of Mars. They've stitched together footage from the Mars rover so that it feels as if you're on the surface of Mars when you're in there. I know that, for example, the electrical and computer engineering classes have gone in to do some visualization projects. Our forensics classes have gone in to do some kind of forensic searching of an apartment to look for clues, to use actively things that they talk about in the classroom. So if you, direct what you'd like to see or do in the cave, that's part of the mission, is to have an educational experience in there.
Well, we could go on and on and on, because I personally have some more follow-up questions
Sure.
for you, but our time is done.
Okay.
And I would like to thank you very much for joining us
Thank
today
you.
here at Radnor Studios 21. And to you, the audience, have a wonderful day and join us again.
Thank you.